I will never have children, and I could think of a lot of complementary reasons why I won't, but really the main reason is I don't recommend life. I mean that in a general sense, but also very specifically because of the direction that our civilization is headed into. I don't want to be responsible for bringing a consciousness into this. I'm always doing deep dives into topics I find interesting, and in the past few years, the full spectrum of sciences have really caught my curiosity. Like things related to the cosmos, agriculture, climate change, microbiology, human behavior, evolution, and so much more. There's so much things that I'm curious about, and there's so little time, but I do deep dives into these topics. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that although I'm not an expert in anything, I read a lot of books and information from people who are experts in their field, and the more I read, the harder it is for me to find information that can convince me that our civilization isn't headed towards a very serious change and transformation, and one that I'm not really looking forward to. And as hard as it is for me to admit and say out loud, it seems to me that it's very clear that things are going to get much worse within our civilization as a whole before it ever has a chance to get better. As a relatively organized civilization, as a human species, one of the most disappointing things to me is that our largest problems are not technological problems. It's not problems that we don't know the solution to. Our biggest problems are not a we don't know what the problem is and how to fix it problem. It's a we don't know how to organize ourselves for the sake and safety of our entire civilization problem. The real problem is that our wide array of governments across the world can't agree. The leadership of different nations and corporate entities are so wrapped up in their own self-interest and their desire to maintain or gain power that they can't come together and agree and cooperate on a way forward for us as a whole. And the real problems that our civilization faces requires a team effort. It can't be partially done. Everyone has to buy in. What's worse is that even if they could unify, I don't think we would do it because of our own individual collective interests. We work very hard to avoid having to sacrifice our lifestyle. And really, as individuals, every day we're in a constant race to improve our lifestyles. That includes me too. I want to be in a better position tomorrow than I am in today. That's just kind of how, as individuals, we tend to think. Just to name a few of the big concerns that we're facing as a species, our soil quality worldwide is degrading at a pretty alarming rate. So not only does it make it harder to grow a lot of food the way we once did, but the nutritional value of that food is much lower than it was even just 50 years ago. I'm talking like double-digit percentage, it seems. Because it's harder to grow things, scarcity becomes a thing. Nations are less willing to ship things out now, and they want to maintain it and within their borders. And that results in what we continuously see, which is food prices going much higher for very basic things. Vegetables, milk, eggs, etc. As ridiculous as it might sound, our oceans are quickly going in the direction of becoming lifeless. And then that mixed with worldwide deforestation is leading to air quality problems. Not to mention the many ways that we're actively polluting the air, and diversity of life is decreasing at alarming rates, which means that the ecosystem is having some problems. And the ecosystem, the natural order of things, is the very thing that human beings rely on in order to maintain this lifestyle that we have. And then of course we have this obsession with plastics, and then which ultimately leads to microplastics, which we don't even know what the full extent of that is, but we know it's bad. Climate change is of course a real problem, which I think everyone has heard about. But as time goes on and I read and I kind of see what people's conversations are like, it seems obvious to me that a lot of us don't appreciate just the level of impact that it's going to have on us in the pretty near future. Climate change is so much more than just some places will get warmer and some places will get colder and the polar bears are going to start suffering and maybe they'll go extinct. That is not anywhere near the extent of what's going on. For some reason, climate change is a very controversial topic. And I think it's largely because of like the polarization of politics. We've politicized climate change. And I find it funny that when I separate myself from the fact that I'm also a human being, I find it interesting that human beings, one of the biggest challenges is that we can't decide on what the problems are that are worth sacrificing and prioritizing in order to address. So important changes that really need to be made don't get made. Or at least if they do get made, they don't get made at the scale that's required in order to affect change, or in a lot of circumstances, they just get postponed. Human behavior is a funny thing. It doesn't matter how advanced we become or how many conveniences we have, We never know, we don't understand what it means to have enough. In general, we just want more and more things. And we want it easier and easier to get. And we want it to be faster and faster. And we want it to be better and better. And like, we don't realize like we're on a finite planet with finite resources, and we act as if we've been led to believe that things keep on going and going and going and getting faster and better and more. It's not realistic. Look, I know we all have very unique, very challenging, very, very difficult lives. And that makes it very easy to not appreciate how much effort and time in organization and strategy goes into allowing us to live in somewhat of a sustainable and stable society that we live in. It's not some universal law that over time things just get better and more stable. Even though the past like 50, 70 years, the advancement of our technology would make it seem like that's the case. Actually, it's the exact opposite. The second law of thermodynamics is all about how everything tends towards entropy. Everything tends towards disorder by nature. And so you can kind of get the idea that in order for us just to maintain our lifestyles as a society, it requires a tremendous amount of effort in organization and strategy. And then even more to try to improve and create more organization and more peace. We refuse to be satisfied, both as individuals and on a national level. And yet we would have to cut back significantly in our quality of life and our expectations on a permanent basis, permanently, if we wanted to have even a chance at setting ourselves on a better path forward that isn't destructive. And we're not even close. For us to really make the changes as a civilization that are necessary to overcome these largely environmental, but also economic problems, which by the way, we've either caused or contributed a lot to make it worse, we would have to make sacrifices on all levels. It seems to me that the players of this game of civilization can be grouped into three main categories, all of which would have to accept things that they naturally don't want to accept in order for things to get better. The first group would be the governing leaders around the world. They would have to accept that the decisions that they'd have to make would lead to their citizens hating them because they wouldn't understand why they're doing it largely. And they would have to accept a very, very low approval rating, which means that they either would have to accept that their citizens are literally going to force them out of office, or in the case of a democracy, that once they make these decisions, they're going to be not voted back in next term. Which, by the way, I think is the exact reason that governments, even though for their people, they know that there are certain decisions that should be made for the best interest of their people, but they don't make it because they know it's too difficult to convey to the whole population in a way that they understand why certain decisions have to be made even though no one's going to like it. And so they don't make that decision because they want a good approval rating. They want to remain in power. And so they just hope that the next term in power will make that decision that really needs to be made so that they can look good and the next term looks bad. But every party that's in office thinks like that. And so the important things never get done. So in this government leadership group, of course, continuing on here, the opposing party also would need to be willing to make changes that the citizens won't like. And that just doesn't happen. So obviously it leads to either change not getting made or it gets made at too small of a scale and too late. So in this government leadership group, these changes won't happen because governments tend to optimize for power and control. They don't optimize for the well-being of their citizens. Citizens are almost always only taken care of at the extent that they need to in order for them to maintain or to further develop their power and control. That's the nature of governments. That's how it's always been. We really don't have examples of that not being the case. Or if we do, I don't know about it. Let me know in the comments if you're aware of any of this, because I'm not. Okay, so the first group was the government and national leaders. The second group is corporate entities. The changes that would need to be made on a really worldwide scale to improve the direction we're going is that these corporate entities would have to accept year over year loss. Not profit, loss. Which, as you know, the only point of corporations for the most part is profit. And so that's the whole point of capitalism. And so that whole system would have to voluntarily collapse because corporations optimize for largely continuous profit and growth. So corporations are not going to voluntarily allow themselves to die for the well-being of humanity. And then last but not least, the third group, you, me, and these normal everyday citizens. We would have to accept some very harsh conditions. Conditions like the price of literally everything going up so high that anyone that's in like the upper middle class and below would pretty much immediately be unable to afford. So basically, the vast majority of us would have to accept a significant and permanent decrease in the quality of our life, not only for ourselves, but also keeping in our mind that's for everyone that we love collectively. I don't know. You don't need me to tell you this, but that obviously means that those people won't be able to afford that lifestyle, which means sooner or later they stop existing. Because if you think about it, at every like social and income class, there are people at each level just barely hanging on. And so every time the price of everything goes up like 1%, let's say, the people that are just barely hanging on, they drop down a class. Well, what happens to the people that are already at the bottom of the lowest class? They fall all the way off and then they stop existing. Well, that happens every year due to inflation. And inflation is a feature of our economic system. It's not a bug. And so what do you think happens when some of our basic needs for survival go up several percentage points year after year, like vegetables, meats, and eggs and whatnot? Well, all of a sudden, people that were in the middle class drop down, then drop down, then drop down, then drop down. And before you know it, you have people that were in the middle class a few years back that drop all the way down and fall off. And they kind of stop existing or stop being able to fend for themselves at a reasonable level. Which is why over the years, you may have heard that the middle class is starting to fade away, because that whole class of people, their income largely isn't keeping up with inflation and the constant increasing prices of things that they need. And so all those people in the middle class, including me, tend to start moving lower and lower. And a lot of them also disappear after certain years. I see people that have full-time incomes that are living in tents down the street from me. It gets bad. So the odds of every individual collectively buying in to the changes and sacrifices that we would need to make to set our civilization, our society as a whole on the right path, it's heavily unlikely. Because as individuals, we optimize for our immediate survival and well-being. And that's just kind of the nature of being a living creature. So I'm not even pointing fingers at anybody. That includes me. So all three of those groups would need to accept some pretty shitty conditions. Government and national leaders would need to accept really bad news. Corporate entities and businesses would need to accept some very bad news. And then the individuals, the common men and women and individuals like you and me, would have to accept some really bad news in order to make the changes necessary to set ourselves on the right path. It's very difficult, if not seemingly unlikely, that just one of those groups would make the necessary changes. But we would need all three to collectively buy in. Man, I'm optimistic in individual potential, but I'm not very optimistic in a whole category, either of those categories, making those decisions and sacrifices voluntarily. Of course, it's not like we can avoid the changes that we have to make by not making them. It just gets delayed. The sacrifices that we will need to make in order to come out of this as a civilization and go on the right track is going to get forced upon us eventually. And for some people, it's getting forced upon them right now. The high level of homelessness you see in every major city is part of that forced changes that you're seeing. The amount of people that that have addictions because of the significant change in the lifestyle is part of that forced change that you're seeing. And over time, those changes are going to be forced upon us higher and higher up the social scale. And it's just kind of a matter of time. And no national leader is going to come out and admit to what's really going on a global scale, on a scale of our entire civilization. Because it would just cause, like they know it would just cause people to panic or start hoarding things and, buying things up at the store. Like we saw what happens during the whole Corona situation when grocery stores weren't getting enough supplies in for like a week. People started hoarding things that they deemed to be important. Or other people would try to capitalize on these social challenges by buying up a bunch of things and then reselling it at a significant profit, which just goes to show that we don't seem to be capable of organizing ourselves in order to meet and overcome large challenges. And the challenges to come are larger than any challenges we faced as a civilization yet. It's hard to be optimistic when every time we've had the opportunity to come together to make a change, we didn't do it. And sometimes for good reason. I wish I could be more optimistic that we were capable of coming together on the scale of hundreds of millions or even billions of people to make the changes we need in society. But I just don't have any, I don't see it. And I actually have this kind of thought, that we didn't evolve to live in communities of millions or tens of millions of people in certain cities. I think instinctually, like we evolved to not be in groups of more than like tens of thousands of people. And I mean in terms of having enough compassion for each other and consideration and care and love and empathy to develop a community that's tight knit, where sacrifices are willing to be made at a collective level in order to see positive change when necessary. I just don't think we don't have it figured out how to work in societies of millions of people. But anyways, that's a topic for another video, but I thought I wanted to mention it here. Getting back on track here though, here in North America, the cost of food is rising quickly. The cost of housing is rising quickly. The cost of energy is rising quickly. The cost of everything is going out of control, and there's no end in sight. It seems to only be getting worse. And the mass immigration solution is not really a solution. It helps, but it seems to just be postponing the inevitable. So there seems to be no real plan in order to make things better. You know, I go to therapy once every 2 weeks, and at this point, it's never for anything too specific. It's just as a maintenance kind of thing. And she's awesome, very intelligent. And I was talking to her about the challenges that we have as a civilization on a global scale. And part of me was going into those conversations hoping that she'd be able to say something to me to make me realize that it's not as bad as it seems, and that it's just me that was misunderstanding what's going on, and you know, I was misreading the patterns. And she couldn't. We ended up just talking about the importance for us all as individuals to do the best we can, be the best person we can, manage our finances as well as we can, not overconsume, you know, maybe learn new skills, and just try to make the most of life and enjoy it, and try to be a net positive back on society. And that's the best we can do. And that's the best that I can do. It's the best that you can do. And that's exactly my personal strategy. But I'm not willing to bring a child into all of this. Life can be kind of a silly game. When you progress through it and you get better at it, there's definitely a thrill. There's a lot of really exciting things that there are to experience in life, which is why I'm doing them all. It doesn't apply to everyone. And life is inherently unfair. Most of life is outside of our control, and there's a lot of luck and just chance of circumstance involved. And of the things that we can control, it requires a significant amount of effort and intent and thought in order to make it really help us in the long run. And for a lot of people, unfortunately, even doing those things isn't enough for them to come out of the difficult hand that life has dealt them. Life is a game with no rules, and you're largely just figuring out as you go along. And there's a lot of thrilling, exciting, stimulating things to experience in life that I really enjoy. And then there are some things that I don't really enjoy. But for the most part, I mean, I'm already here, you're already here. The best we can do is to make the most of it and really take advantage of this forced opportunity to be you know, on this planet. However, this is a sport that I'm not looking to recruit a new person into that isn't already here. Life can be and is extremely interesting. I get most of my enjoyment out of just learning new things and exploring the seemingly endless curiosities that I have. I have a lot of great hobbies. I take part in a lot of great experiences. I read a lot of books. I travel every year. I have an amazing partner of 8 years, and I have a lot of good friends. And as good as all of that is, and it's really good, I'm very privileged, it still doesn't weigh enough to counteract the other challenges to the extent that I want to bring a new life into this world. And sure, I might be a little biased, but I think that I've spent a lot of time considering it, and I don't think I'm making any split-second emotional judgment when I say these things. I think I'm saying it from a pretty balanced point of view and perspective. I'm not in an emotional state right now. It's the way I feel when I just consider and observe and express how I feel. I say this all as someone who's very fortunate. I recognize that as a regular middle-class Canadian, I'm in the top 1% in the entire world in terms of quality of life. And at 33 years old, my life is only getting better. I'm the most fortunate and content that I've ever been. And I still feel this way. But I'm very aware of the road that we're headed down as a civilization. And I'm aware that through various fields of science, they are screaming at the world in their reports. And sometimes they're emotionally neutral words. But nonetheless, they're screaming, saying we need to make a change as a society in the way that we're operating and our expectations of the future. And to be more realistic, that we can't keep on consuming and consuming, consuming and expect it to not have any repercussions down the line. We just don't collectively seem to be doing enough. And I'm reminded of that every time I go to Walmart and I buy a $2 cucumber that's individually wrapped in plastic. You know, we're getting worse. I feel like 10 years ago, produce wasn't individually wrapped in plastic. We didn't see plastic being used at every little opportunity where you buy like a package of chocolate and then you open the package of chocolate just for other pieces of chocolate to be individually wrapped in plastic. It's ridiculous. This isn't about civilization coming to an end or the end of humanity or anything, but it is about our civilization going through a significant and difficult transformation, which I'm not looking forward to. And I certainly am not willing to bring a life into this knowing what we're headed into and what we kind of are already starting to experience. I already know some people will hear this and think, oh, so you're just gonna give up on trying to build a better future? And the answer is absolutely not. If anything, it encourages me to continue doing better and being better and making the most out of my life. But there's a big difference between already being here and making the best of it versus volunteering my unborn child into this life to face the challenges of things that we were already aware of even decades ago that were going to come and we didn't do enough. And now people would expect me to bring a child into this to face the consequences of our actions. I wouldn't be able to do that personally. No judgment on anyone else. Clearly, no judgment on no one else. But this is just about me and my perspective. Oftentimes, people will talk about what the world's going to be like in 50 years or 100 years or 300 years. And you know, I'm all I can think about is what is the world going to be like in 10 years? It's not very long from now that I'm worried. It seems like it's in our backyard. It's starting to approach. Already, it's common to see, at least in North America, it's common to see people, like couples that both work full time and still manage to struggle with being able to afford healthy food, still manage to struggle with being able to afford a consistent place to live without worrying about the cost of living, their rent going up beyond their ability to afford it. The cost of general education might be free, like through the internet, but the cost of formal education, which is a significant factor in people being able to increase the quality of their life by getting higher paying careers, that has become so astronomically and unnecessarily expensive that for a lot of people with a lot of interest, it just doesn't make sense to go to school because the amount of debt is just, it's unreasonable. As good as we have it today in terms of medical advancements and technological conveniences and relative peace from war, a lot of the benefits that came from that didn't go to the people, to the individuals. It mostly went into the pockets of people that were already wealthy and corporations that are already doing record profits. It doesn't trickle down to us the way we once thought it would. Just 10 or 20 years ago, people were talking about how the advancement of technology and the emergence of AI would allow the average person to only have to work half the amount of hours per week that they normally would and still earn the same amount of money and give them more time to spend doing the things that they love. Nope. Instead, the average person is working more hours to afford less. This is the exact opposite of what we were told we could expect as technology unfolds and we start to advance. I think of our civilization and the way we're kind of dismissing warnings as an explorer that's walking towards the cave, right? And a bunch of the local knowledgeable people are like, hey, there's a cave up front of you. I'm sure you see that cave. Don't step foot into the cave because there's a dragon in there. And as soon as you walk into the cave, a giant door slams behind you, locking you in there. And eventually the dragon's gonna get you. And then that explorer is like, are you kidding me? This is the fanciest cave I've ever seen. Look at all that cool stuff inside, it's beautiful. Even though I can see that big heavy door you're talking about, and I can see the dragon footprint going into the cave, all the signs you're telling me to be aware of are there. And so he's just like, meh, I'm going in anyway. And plus, I don't expect to go in so far that I encounter the damn dragon. I just want to see all this cool stuff, baby. Bye! As he says as he's walking into the cave and the giant door shuts behind him. And then the locals that warned him are like, you fool. Like, yes, the warning was about the dragon, who's definitely going to find you and just end you. But the real warning was about the door that's going to slam shut behind you, trapping you in here. And then it's just a matter of time before the dragon gets you. Okay, so that's the end of my little allegorical story. I'm certainly not trying to scare anybody or convince anybody of anything. I'm just kind of expressing my perspective as I see it. Because right now, I worry for teenagers. Because teenagers trying to enter the workforce now are having a very hard time just getting a job. No longer can teenagers go to Walmart or McDonald's or Tim Hortons and find a job to kind of get into the workforce. They're just not available anymore. The idea of people being able to be in their like late teens, early 20s, and try to find a way to be independent and live, it's just not happening anymore. Never mind thinking about people that are being born today that in 15, 20, 25 years are going to enter adulthood and try to find their way. It's not getting better. If I had to guess, people that are born today, by the time they get to the working age, it's probably going to involve universal basic income and restrictions on what they can and cannot do that is so heavy, the line between being considered free and not free starts to blur together. And clearly, there are people who are far more intelligent and knowledgeable than me that work across these scientific fields that are even more aware of all this than me, who are still having kids. The reason I'm not is because I generally don't have an impulse to have children. But if I was, or if I did have a bit of an impulse, and I was kind of on the fence about whether or not to have children, these are the things that would completely prevent me from going into that journey and bringing life into this world. The way I see it, when it comes to deciding whether or not to have children, if it's not an enthusiastic yes to your desire to have children, it should probably be an enthusiastic no. Because parenthood is not something that should be decided based on half measures or spur of the moment decision. It's such a serious responsibility, and the consequences of not taking it seriously are so large, not for the parent, but for the child. If you want to just gently dip your toes into understanding the challenges that we're facing on a like threat to humanity level, there's a really good Netflix documentary I watched a couple years ago called Breaking Boundaries: The Science of Our Planet. They only scratch the surface of the topic, but I think they do a really good job at putting a lot of information and making it well-rounded into like an hour and a half documentary. And personally, I find this stuff very fascinating. So I think some of you might too. Honestly, for most people, that documentary will be enough to at least just change the way you think about our civilization. And from there, you can do a deep dive if you want. And I know it's not a positive or fun topic, but I think it's important for people to understand because we can't collectively make the changes necessary unless we all understand why these changes need to be made. So if we have any hope of changing the direction we're going, everyone has to start to understand what's going on in the world, not just in their little bubble of life. I can only hope that with the help of AI and new technology, and somehow all of us having a philosophy of enough, that we can start to make the changes necessary to make sure that we have a solid future and civilization as a whole can remain stable. And look, I'm well aware of how negative this all can sound, and I'm aware that a lot of people are either gonna violently disagree with me, or they don't believe any of this is real in the first place. I understand that going into this video. As uncomfortable as I actually feel making videos like this, I think it's important because I try to make an attempt at sharing what I feel, talking about what I think about, being open, and just trying to get people to think for themselves. So I thought it was important for me to sort of indirectly address this situation without getting into too much detail. There's a quote that I've put to memory that I really value, and it's that it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. I don't dwell on this topic too much, and I try not to think about it for too long because it can be a hard pill to swallow. I'm already here in this world. I'm doing the best I can. I'm just trying to be the best person I can, not consume too much resources, not be too greedy, not want, not replacing my cell phone or buying new clothes all the time. I'm just trying to be a reasonable person and live a fantastic life. This whole video is just a long-winded way of saying that despite all the good that there is, I will not be bringing a life, a consciousness, an unborn spirit into this world. Because despite all the good things, It's just not enough for me to recommend.